Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our live stream broadcast, Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. I'm your host, Wade Fransson. I'm here with Jafar Falahi, who you may recall from the last couple of shows. We do hope that our regular guest, Daniel Sanderson, from up in the frozen white wasteland of Canada, will be here with us soon. We will be shifting our time to an hour later next week in order to accommodate the different time zones of some of our participants. It is a little bit difficult for Daniel to get here at this time each week, given that he's on Pacific time on the West Coast. But do click to like and subscribe right away so that you can stay up to speed with all the announcements and changes as we move forward with this show. We're going to pick up where we left off last week in talking about the role of the Declaration of Independence and the fact that Thomas Farr in the Wall Street Journal wrote an article declaring it to be a radical document in that it stated that we were created with unalienable rights. And he said that this is not only radical but revolutionary and powerful and profound in that it applies to everyone, and in that it is non-coercive. And we dove into the idea of being non-coercive. Why? Because in discussing the role of religion in society, we know from history that religion has often been coercive, right? There have been other coercive forms of government. It's not only religion. Right. We can look at what happened in the last century or two, particularly in some countries where religion was in fact outlawed and where they founded their nation on the principle that there would be no religion, and they became some of the most oppressive, coercive regimes in human history. In fact, 20 million or more of their own citizens were murdered in the pursuit of their utopian vision, which was separate and apart from religion. I have to emphasize this because in the context that we're about to talk about, we're really focusing on the fact that religion is sometimes coercive. And I don't want it to sound like that we think religion is the problem on this show. It is the misunderstanding of the divine revelation. It is the misapplication of religious ideas that becomes coercive, not the idea of religion itself. This nation, the United States of America, was founded on religious principles, on spiritual principles, on the belief in a divine creator God who had given the founders of this nation unique insights based on their experiences, based on having to flee persecution in order to obtain religious freedom. And so that Declaration of Independence from the kings of Great Britain, England, the British Empire, were founded in that idea that God has given us certain unalienable rights and freedoms, and that the United States was founded on the principle of freedom of religion and therefore not coercive in a religious way. And in fact, America has been a beacon of light and freedom, flaws and all, warts and all, throughout its history over the last several hundred years. We have moved from being a nation that had several, you might say, original sins, in that we did not treat the Native Americans in a fair and just manner, in that we had chattel slavery, and we fought a civil war over those issues. But the fundamental principles upon which this nation were founded were, in fact, as stated by Thomas Farr in that article, universal for our citizens and everyone in this nation, unalienable rights, and it was non-coercive, with freedom of speech to believe and say what you feel and think and believe. We wanted to then take that and ask the question, well, we don't really want this show to be about the role of religion in America, right? We want this show to be more universal. What is the role of religion in human society? So taking a stepping stone from the Declaration of Independence here in the United States of America, there is a document that takes those same principles and seeks to extend it more universally. And that document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Jafar and I have talked a little bit about this offline. He's actually one who has thought about this Declaration of Human Rights in ways that I had not, even before I began to look at it and examine it. And I don't know if, Jafar, if you want to share a little bit your thoughts about that declaration, what it is, what it symbolizes, whatever you want to share about the history. If you could just sort of introduce that idea about the Declaration of Human Rights.
Well, I mean, everybody probably knows it came after World War II, and it came in response to World War I and World War II and everything that happened then. So it was something that all the countries of the world came together and said, we have to stop this from happening again. And so they drafted and agreed on a set of rights that every human individual on the planet should have, and that no one on the planet, no one nor any government or anything on the planet could remove from them, which is what inalienable means, or unalienable. There's nothing that can ever take those things away. And so in a sense, that document became, and tell me what you think about this, Wade, it became the King of Kings, in that it all the governments of the world agreed to hold it above them, and it made them subservient to that document. And so it became the ideal for any government to strive towards, and something that they all had to bow a knee to, so to speak. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about lately. And so when I read it recently, over the last couple of years, I started to take it really seriously, and I found it very profound, because there's never obviously been something like that in human history. And what it was responding to was something that had never happened in human history also.
Thanks, Jafar. Yeah, you referred to something that you and I talked about last week, and so let me go into that a little bit for our audience. When Jesus came and proclaimed who he was, there are various prophecies about his return and his kingdom, and that every knee would bow to him. And I was just sharing the perspective that the fact of most of the nations of Western civilization since that time is that kings were, sorry, I had some noise in the background there, I apologize. Kings were actually coronated by bowing the knee to the name of Jesus Christ. And they were actually assuming their authority under the authority of Jesus by virtue of how they were ordained, coronated as kings. And we were talking about how the Bible prophesies that the mountains will be leveled at Jesus' return. And again, it's my opinion. Well, you can go look up what mountains are symbolized in the Bible. They symbolize governments often, right? A mountain, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and his God. We'll look at a prophecy about this in a few minutes to give an example of this. So when it talks about mountains in the Bible, it often is referring to governments, and the mountains being leveled is referring to these governments being leveled. Well, the kings have all been dethroned largely across the planet over the last several 100 years, and I won't get into exactly how or why that is, but it does, in my opinion, have to do with those prophecies. And the authority has now been conferred upon the people, who are electing their leaders through democracies. And again, that's a bigger, broader discussion if you want to look at it from a biblical and a prophetic perspective as to how and why that's happening. But to your point, what is the standard then by which the nations would be judged, right? Well, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as you pointed out. And so let us now make a leap back into the Bible, and I'm going to share some verses from the, let's see, I had it open here, from the book of Amos, I believe it is. Excuse me, Micah, sorry. This is referenced in a number of places. So we're looking at the New King James Version here of the Bible in Micah chapter 4. And the title here is The Lord's Reign in Zion. And I'll just post in the comments here some of this text while we go to it. And it reads, Micah chapter 4, verse 1, the New King James Version. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days, and I'll just share this here. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains. And again, this is referring to governmental authority. It's symbolic. And shall be exalted above the hills. This is the way that this is posting here. It's really chopping it up and only allowing a small portion to be shown. So I will just try to work with this here. So bear with me. I'll post it again in the comments. I could perhaps screen share. That might be easier. Let me just do that. So we're using Bible Gateway here. Let me go to full screen here, if I can. Oh, all right. I'll just read this again then. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall the law go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this is the context from the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament, about the Messiah, who Christians believe will return, i.e. just returns, and establishes his kingdom over all the other kingdoms. And this is the important part here we're going to get into. And he shall judge between many peoples, and rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, our audience will probably be aware that this verse is a profound, powerful verse that was used symbolically for the United Nations. I don't know if Jeremiah or Jafar, if you want to post an image or a picture of the statue that I think exists out in front of the United Nations of this very act of somebody beating a sword into a plowshare. This is symbolic of this verse from the Bible. And what I'm wanting to share here is what has emerged from the discussions that we had last week, Daniel, Jafar, and I, in talking about this Universal Declaration, or this Declaration of Independence, and then the Declaration of Human Rights, thinking about the United Nations and what it symbolizes, and then in the context of these verses from the Bible. Now, I've just shown you the the Hebrew Bible version of it. But now I want to go to the version that is shared by, or excuse me, the version that was presented by Jesus himself in the Olivet prophecy in Matthew 25, in which it appears Jesus is discussing the same situation, but he's doing it in a way that I've never connected before. But to me, in reflecting upon it, it's obviously discussing the same thing, just updated 2,000 years later with a little bit more context, with a little bit more application of universality. So what we read from the Hebrew scriptures was very much focused on the Hebrew perspective, what we call the Jewish perspective. Though there were 12 tribes of Israel, there was the nation of Israel in the northern part of the Holy Land, and then there was the nation of Judah in the southern part, and these were all the 12 tribes of Israel. 10 of them have been lost. So what we refer to today as the Jews, or even as Israel, is only a subset, a small portion of the peoples who had those books and those prophecies. It's actually very complex. You can spend a lifetime studying into it, as I have, and continue to learn the nuance of what prophecy is and how it's being fulfilled, and how it has been fulfilled and is being fulfilled. But now, when we go and look at what Jesus said 2,000 years later, he makes it more universal. We read elsewhere that he will magnify the law and make it honorable. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. And what I'm proposing here, what I'm presenting as my perspective, my opinion, is that is exactly what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is. It is the law magnified and made honorable. There, by the way, is the image of the swords into plowshares from the statue. Thank you, Maya. If anyone wants to look it up, you can go do so. So, not sure how well everybody can read this text. I should have perhaps optimized it a little bit more, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to futz around with it right now. I'll just jump into this. So, here in Matthew chapter 25, we read, "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, and then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory." And again, I'm presenting that this is the exact same time as described in the book of Micah that we just looked at, which also, by the way, is quoted almost exactly in the book of Isaiah. The same thing. Those prophecies about the time of the end, when the mountain of the Lord is established above the other mountains, when the government of God, when the kingdom of God is established over the nations. And again, we saw that happening throughout human history, in that the kings of the earth were coronated in the name of Jesus, and their knees were bowed to him as representatives of the people. And by the way, for those in Islam, we had the same thing under Muhammad, right? So this is a pattern of God asserting his authority over humankind, but in a non-coercive way. It is intended, right? The revelation of God doesn't coerce. Depending on how the religion is applied, it becomes coercive, as we've seen both in Christianity and Islam. Islam being a more modern example of coercive religion. But Christianity was equally coercive in its day, in its heyday. You follow me? So the intent was not to coerce and force the people, even though the writings are sometimes conveyed and portrayed in that manner. And when you carefully read them in the context, you realize God is not telling us to go out and force that upon people. It is intended to be non-coercive. But God himself, gradually over time, achieves this submission, achieves this desire to submit one's own will to the will of God. And here it says, "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, all the holy angels with him," talking about that same time when the mountain of the Lord shall be established above the other mountains. And here we have that same kind of phrase. "Before him will be gathered all the nations," which is exactly what it's talking about in the book of Micah and in the book of Isaiah, where this prophecy about the plowshares is coming into place. And he shall separate them one from another as the shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. So I've always read this verse in the context of an individual application of me personally wanting to be a sheep, not a goat, right? Because the fate of the sheep is much better than the fate of the goats, if you want to read it. But it's actually not apparently talking about individual application. It obviously does apply individually. But what he's saying is here is he will gather the nations and separate them, the nations. And so then it talks about the standard of behavior, which is in essence the golden rule. Are we treating people equitably? Are we giving the thirsty water? Are we giving food to the hungry? Have we established a minimum level of conduct and behavior towards our fellow man? Now, this is talking about nations, not individuals. It's really not saying that you as an individual went and gave a thirsty person water. Of course, that is true. But are the nations taking care of their people? Have the nations established a foundation for human rights? Elsewhere in the book of Matthew, we're told not to judge, and that we will be judged by the same standard that we establish judgment through. Again, the Declaration of Human Rights establishes that judgment by which the nations are judged. And it is God who ultimately does the judging. But what we see is that a framework for human conduct has been established in this day, by which the nations can be judged because they've signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I will now stop for a moment my monologue here and invite Jafar to comment, because Jafar, again, you and I have talked about this and you've got some interesting perspectives there as well in terms of what was done when this was rolled out and the number of nations that have signed on to it. Perhaps those stats, if you have them handy, that you shared with me about the most translated documents in human history.
Right. Yeah. Well, when I looked into it, I thought it was really interesting because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the second most translated document. It actually, in the Guinness Book of World Records, it says that it's the most translated, but I think that has to do with the speed at which it was translated in, because it was just a matter of, I don't know, probably decades before it was translated into something like, what was it, more than 500 languages? And the Bible,
I think you said it was between 300 and 400 at least different languages, whereas the Bible was close to 700, something like that.
Something like that. It's yeah. So for the amount of time that it took, it holds the world record for being translated into the most languages. So that's kind of interesting because it is actually universal, and everyone, virtually, not everyone, but most people have access to it. So if you're just about anyone anywhere in the world can go look at this document and read it for themselves and understand what their rights are, which is that in the Bible basically. So it kind of educates people as to what they can expect from their government, I guess, also. But yeah, I mean that's what I got out of that. The other thing is that almost every country signed onto it. I don't remember the exact stats. So it is universal in the sense that all the countries agreed that this is a standard that they should all be held over them, basically. So yeah. And when I read it for the first time, I don't know. There's something, I just felt that there's something profound about it.
So, and again, my particular unique sensibility here, right or wrong, I like to look at everything through the lens of the Bible. It has been, for me personally, a trustworthy guide throughout my life. And I have found over and over again that the prophecy of the Bible, to the degree that I can understand them, to the degree that I can figure out and apply them, not just me, but also reading and other people's perspectives, it's obviously easier in hindsight to see the prophecies being fulfilled than when they are fulfilling, because the way they're written, one could gain the impression it's going to look this way, it's going to look that way, it's going to be this way, it's going to be, perhaps more dramatic on the surface than one thought. Biggest example of that is the prophecies of Jesus in the Hebrew Bible. And then when he actually came and he was the suffering lamb, which prophecies you can easily find in the Hebrew scriptures. But there are these other prophecies about Jesus, the conquering king. And obviously you can imagine which version of a savior the peoples throughout history would rather have. The suffering lamb who dies on your behalf. Again, woven into the fabric of Jewish life and the Hebrew scriptures, the Passover, right? The slaying of the Passover lamb. But much rather would one not want to imagine one's savior as the conquering king who's going to come and vanquish one's enemies. And then it talks in the Bible about, yes, death is even the enemy that was vanquished through Jesus by sacrificing himself so that we might have eternal life, for example. However, the imagination that Jesus was going to be the conquering king caused many people to not see Jesus as the fulfillment of their prophecies when he arrived. And what I'm saying is that in similar ways, perhaps we are just coming to begin to see the Declaration of Human Rights as the application of divine law. And I personally, for one, again, long-winded monologue here again, but to cover the context of what I'm about to say and what I was about to say 2 minutes ago, which is that the Declaration of Human Rights was issued in what year, Jafar?
So like 40, was it 44 or I forget.
48.
48.
And in what year was the modern nation of Israel founded?
I could guess, but
it's also
cheating.
1948. It's also 1948, right? So, coincidence? Perhaps. I personally don't believe there are any coincidences. It's all part of a weave, right? If you look at a tapestry on a wall, depending, you have to get the certain perspective. If you go up too close, they're just different colored threads, right? You can't see the picture at all. It's like more in the modern day, if you look too close at an image, it's just a bunch of pixels, right? You can't make out the pattern, but you take a step back to the appropriate distance, you can see the whole picture, right? And I don't believe for 1 second that it's a coincidence that the modern state of Israel was established in 1948, the same year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was issued. And in fact, they are tied together because it was the Holocaust, it was the experience of the Jewish people in one of the singular most heinous violations of human rights in human history during World War II, through which crucible all this arose and all this came about. So if you're looking for dramatic events for the fulfillment of prophecy, look no further than 1944 to 1948. And what emerged from that was the state of Israel, Zion, the Holy Hill. From Jerusalem shall go forth the law, right? And okay, the Declaration of Human Rights did not come from Israel, but you see the connection there in the weave of the fabric in 1948. And since then, this has become the gold standard, and we've also heard the term the golden rule. Treat your neighbor as yourself, as you would want to be treated. The golden rule is now the gold standard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, add on to that what came later, and we might dive into this a lot deeper in future shows, which is the beginning of the beating of swords into plowshares. in order to end World War II, there was an arms race to develop weapons powerful enough to either win World War II, right? The nations were in an escalation of armaments to try to win that war. And ultimately, it was the United States of America that developed the weapons that had the capability to definitively end the war. And it wasn't until later, even after Germany was largely vanquished, that the war ended with the application of those nuclear weapons, which was, of course, a horrible event in history. But coming out of that, even, what emerged decades later was, perhaps for the first time in human history, and I believe this to be true, for the first time in human history, we had international agreement, largely universal, on the limitation of armaments, the beating of swords into plowshares, right? When nuclear weapons were governed by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which again had hundreds of nations signing on to it, which again emerged through the horror of these cataclysmic events that are biblical in their proportion. So what am I getting at here? We need to understand that these words that were written down in the holy writings, that these prophecies, that they are very, very real, and they can be trusted. And it is worth our time to look and see with the eyes of divine inspiration, to see how God is progressing humanity's fortunes, how he has been guiding humanity along a tortuous path. Torturous because of our willingness to disobey, because of our insistence on going our own way, which is a God-given right, freedom of choice. Because God himself is not coercive. He has created a universe that functions by certain laws that allows us to come of our own free will to an understanding and a desire to submit our will to his greater wisdom. Jafar, I'll stop there and let you share your comments and thoughts about all of this.
Well, I wanted to see, well, first, I think a couple episodes we talked about Nietzsche and the middle of the 19th century. And Nietzsche, what he did was he didn't say that God was dead. He observed that God was dead. He wasn't saying that he didn't think that God existed. He was saying that it's the spirit of the time that God is dead or dying. People are changing. People are no longer looking at religion or God the way they once did. And so his analysis of things to come was that there was no longer going to be this sort of overarching church or idea or that people believed in, and he thought that once that was gone, then there would be no unifying ethos, right? And people would have to then, instead of submitting to a higher power, people would then have to create their own versions of power and authority, right? And so he came up with the idea of the I think the Ubermensch, or the Overman or Superman. And so he prophesied that this kind of overlord man would be the one to take power and create the systems of the world and the like a human-made religion. And he said, and not only did he prophesied that, he said that it would be disastrous, basically massively disastrous. And so then what happened, in the
so are you saying that Nietzsche got a bad rap from declaring God to be dead, and that he was actually kind of saying the opposite in a way of what people take away from that?
Yes, I don't think people generally, most people don't. I think a lot of people don't understand Nietzsche. Even a lot of philosophers probably don't understand Nietzsche. But I think that but Nietzsche was just examining the world in which he lived. I don't know whether he believed in God or whether that matters, but he was examining the world in which he lived, and he was predicting what this change in people's attitudes towards religion and God would have in the future. And so then you get, so the Nazis, I think, I don't know if they directly or if it was indirectly, but they got a hold of this idea of this greater men, like this race of men that was better than everyone else and that had the right to take control and run the world, right? And that's, they believed it, you know, more than most people believe anything. And so they made it happen, or they tried to make it happen. And so, you know, and so the point being is, look what happens when a country or a people doesn't submit to Christ, say, for example, or Muhammad,
a divine authority,
a divine authority that is inaccessible and beyond this world. The other thing is that it, you know, that divine authority of the Catholic Church or Islam, it taught that there was another world to which we were striving to, and this one wasn't the only one, or it wasn't the most real one, right? So, but that, you know, I don't know what the Hitler believed, but, you know, if you believe that this is it, that there's nothing more, then the ends justify the means 100%. Like, this is it. Like, if you think you know the truth, then you make it happen. The ends justify the means, right? So, but if you believe that there's another world, then it changes things, you know? So, and that's where I think it links up with this. I wanted to see what you thought, but it kind of links up with this non-coercion idea. Like, the purpose of this life, in my opinion, as a religious person, is not to have this perfect life that I imagine in my head and make it happen 100%. The purpose of my life is to develop spiritual qualities, you know, and it's also to have a great life. But if I have to sacrifice my great life for virtues and my honor and my dignity and not lying, you know, if I have to sacrifice for those standards, so be it. Like, those things are more important than my car or my house or whatever it is, right? So this is the thing that I think people don't, I mean, from my perspective, I didn't come from I came from kind of more of a, I mean, I grew up religious, but I came from kind of a more secular world than you did, Wade. And so I think that in the circles that I ran in, people were kind of like dismissing religion as dumb and stupid. And I think that when you do that, you're throwing something out. And I think that people don't realize what they're losing in doing that by making the material world the most important thing. You know, you start to cut corners. Like, if that's the case, you start to cut corners. You don't have a reason not to, you know, because there's no invisible person seeing everything you do anymore, right? So you can hide things, right? So I think, I think that links up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it becomes the invisible thing that all the nations have to know that, oh, that thing is watching, even though there's the UN or whatever doesn't have the power or authority to enforce each country, you know, to, I guess they try, right? But, you know, everybody knows that those are the standards. So every person in China or Afghanistan or wherever can read that document and know whether or not the government or their country are violating those laws, right? So there is like this all-seeing eye of the, you know, that has been established, that all the nations of the world are whether they submit to it or not, they're being judged.
Yeah, so you've raised so many interesting thoughts. I want to comment on just a couple of them. First of all, this idea of coercion, and you talked about means. I believe that for those who are willing to perform some form of coercion, whatever that is, and for whatever reasons, they will find the means. They will invent the means. It's not just even about just the ends justify the means, right? It's like, we need to find a way. That's this famous phrase, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, right? Because we can use that crisis as a means to accomplish this other goal here, right? In a crisis, you can coerce, right? When everybody's hair on fire, you know, somebody has to step in and be the authority, the adult in the room, to put it in a positive way. If we accept that this coercion is acceptable, then we have the horrors that Nietzsche said would come about. We have the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I have commented on how that used to be the domain of religion to proclaim gloom and doom, the famine, the starvation, right? Well, now the sun getting 10 times hotter, that's a biblical image, right? Well, no, science in quotes has taken on the role of the proclaimer of apocalyptic horsemen, right? And it's not the priests that can stand up and tell people what to do to, save yourselves. The end is near. Those old cartoons, the guy standing with the sign, the end is near, right? Trying to warn people. It's a joke. But it's not a joke when someone in the name of science stands up and says it. And then everyone has to scurry like rats and obey the proclamations, the edicts by those who are seeking to coerce. And I'm not even talking about their motives. Their motives may be pure. They may actually 100% believe that this is good, that this is right, that this is the best thing, and they're trying to help people and they're trying to save people. But it is never okay to be coercive in that way. This gets back again to some of those verses that we read in the early shows of this program, going back to the book of Genesis, in which God says he created us in his image. In fact, our very title, created in the image of God. That means you have a degree of sovereignty under God. That you have a degree of sovereignty that nobody else can take away from you. The unalienable rights and the sovereignty that you have before God. And the fact that God will honor that even if you are subjected to coercion, or even the horrors of World War II if you were Jewish. And yet you can go through those things and retain your sovereignty before God, despite everything. And Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. That was another thought I had when you were talking about, what are the standards? You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. But back over to you. I think I've done plenty of commenting on what you said there. You probably have some thoughts to share as well.
Well, the only other thing I was thinking that, because like if you don't have a framework of rules, right, to determine if the ends justify, or determine what the path through to your goal is, or what your goal should be, then you don't have any way to judge whether your goal is good or bad, right? Because you can come up with a goal in your head, say we need to have this much economic output, or we need to have this many babies, or whatever it is. Whatever you come up with, a nation comes up in its head with how things should be. If there's no standard to judge those ideas, then they're just right? Like they can't be wrong, because they're just the only idea that's had, and you do it, you don't question it, right? And so I don't think.
Well, and you have to continue to maintain that illusion, right?
Right.
Because the minute everybody believes that they're not trustworthy, that they're not right, well, then you begin to lose the control that you need to coerce, right? And again, throughout human history, this has been tried over and over and over again, going back to Daniel and the image of Nebuchadnezzar with the golden head and the shoulders of silver and bronze, and on down to the feet of clay and iron, right? As human societies have sought to crack this nut, right? Have sought to try to figure out how to establish a sustainable society, right? But it's been done through coercion, right? And that coercion, one time was simple brute force, right? And the nations have gotten ever more sophisticated at controlling people. And today we have the most elaborate systems of control ever designed with technology and information control, right? Because every human being as an individual is also growing in their capacities over time, in theory, right? Certainly with education levels and what we're learning as a species about how to raise families and nurture our children, and ever more sophisticated, and the methods of control and manipulation and coercion have become ever more sophisticated.
You had talked about like it's not for me to judge a nation. I don't think that it's possible. I don't think that I have access to the information necessary to and you know I can make judgments, but it's not technically, it's useless, and I'm powerless, and I don't have the knowledge to really know one way or the other. It's like you can't really judge another person's heart, right? You can try, but you're probably going to be, you know, wrong because you don't have direct access to their heart and their mind, right? So,
In fact, religiously, you know, spiritually, we are forbidden. That is the domain of God. No one has the right to judge another's heart.
So is that in the Bible? That
absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well,
because
well, in the Bible, well, so full disclosure, and yeah, we've talked about this. For the record, I'm a Baha'i, right? This was never a Christian show, right? I am formerly a Christian minister, and I'm deeply versed in the Bible, Old Hebrew scriptures. I keep wanting to say Old Testament. I don't have it. Hebrew scriptures and the you know, Christian revelation. And so there are some things in the Baha'i writings that are more specific to what I just said. In fact, in the Bible, it's almost the opposite. In the Bible, you have things like the heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all things. Who can know it? The Bible, you know, the Hebrew scriptures in particular, they're very earthy, very direct, and they get to the heart and core about how we even deceive ourselves. And, you know, God reveals that he knew us before we were born. He knew us in the womb, right? He knows our inmost thoughts. But we're repeatedly told not to judge other people and to judge righteous judgment, right? So clearly, there's every indication in the Bible. It is, you have no authority to judge another man's heart. And the minute you do, you're violating a number of principles.
So
deep
it said
spiritual
in the
principles.
verses you read, right? It said in those verses that God would judge the nations.
Correct.
Right.
Right. So what you're getting at, and we'll explore this in more detail in a future show. But you've got these twin aspects, right? You've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the standard which the world has now said we should be judged on this standard. And there are also verses that Jesus talked about how he would judge us by the standards we set. And he gives specific examples, and they're actually kind of fun to read in a way. Painful if you recognize that they're talking about you. You can't just apply them to other people. You got to apply them to yourself. But he does refer to the fact that, you know, he will judge us by the standards with which we judge others. And that universal standard has now been established through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it's my opinion, and again, this gets back to the coercion, that, you know, we don't have, in one sense, the authority to meddle in other nations' internal business, right? We've seen a lot of that going on. You know, elections, right? Nations interfering in other nations' elections, in their governance, right? This is heinous. This is, you know, this gets into that coercion of trying to force other people to live by our standards. But then there is this aspect of international relations, and what a nation does vis-a-vis its neighbors, and what a nation's rights to maintain the integrity of its borders, right? And I know this is controversial, but to maintain integrity of its borders. And when nations infringe upon other nations' borders, this is a different matter than human rights that might be managed by a people within their own nation. And it's a difficult, thorny thing. I'm not trying to oversimplify or speak definitively, but these are very different things, right? And so, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we referred to earlier, had a coda for musicians, a coda is, a musical piece that goes at the end of the main piece. But this coda is really fascinating and powerful. I was actually in Europe at the time the Soviet Union was collapsing and its satellite nations were spinning off. I had a visa to go visit the Ukraine at the time this was happening. I was very, very aware of what was going on. And it used to be called the Ukraine. It's just Ukraine now, right? So what happened was when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had just about the most nukes on its soil as any nation on earth. And now suddenly it was an independent nation. The issue came up. Well, what are you going to do about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? You want to join the family of nations. You want to participate in the family of nations and become a citizen of the family of nations, right? Because within a nation, you have citizens, right? The United States is fascinating because it's really the United Nations of America. A state in the 18th century was a nation. America is a collection of 50 nations in that sense. We're just so united that nobody thinks of it that way. But the American model is a model of how the nations should agree and cooperate. What degree of sovereignty do they give up? What degree of sovereignty do they maintain? That's why you have this phrase in America, the sovereign state of Texas, because Texas is perhaps more vocal and insistent about its sovereign rights than some other states. But Texas is not wrong in emphasizing aspects of its sovereignty, because it does have aspects of sovereignty as it cooperates with a federal government. This is why America is, in fact, a model for the world, one of reasons. So you have the family of nations and you have individual nations who cooperate in that family of nations. And so now what's Ukraine going to do? Well, in order to sign on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was a Budapest Memorandum. And Budapest is an interesting city because it was one of the premier leaders of breaking away from the dominance of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, right? And the Budapest Memorandum was signed by Ukraine, the United States of America, Russia, and Great Britain, right? Three of the dominant global players, three of them on the Security Council of the United Nations. And the Budapest Memorandum stipulated that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons and become a non-nuclear state in exchange for guarantees that its sovereignty would be honored and that its territorial integrity would not be violated. I'd have to go look at the exact memorandum. Weren't the specific words, but that's the principle, right? Is that Russia, Great Britain, and the United States would honor the sanctity of Ukraine's independence in exchange for its giving up its nuclear weapons. Well, guess what? It gave up its nuclear weapons. And that Budapest Memorandum has been flushed down the toilet. When Russia invaded Crimea years ago, nothing happened. Russia, one of the signatories, violated the Budapest Memorandum. Now, this is a sacred agreement, right? Because we're talking about biblical prophecy that goes back thousands of years. We're talking about the time. And very few people recognize this, right? Because most of the people who believe in the Bible, either, let's say the Jews, right? There's an issue there, even related to understanding and accepting who Jesus was, right? Christians have a perspective on who Jesus was, and they sometimes dismiss Moses and discount Moses, right? And, Jesus came to nail the law to the cross, which is not theologically correct in my opinion. So now you've got the Christians who are expecting Jesus to return, have struggled with putting the pieces together because you can't have a state of Israel where the Jews are gathered together until after Jesus returns in the history and prophecy of the Bible. So that's a big problem. And so there are various perspectives and ideologies, and in fact it says in Isaiah that he will set up an ensign to the nations, and one of the aspects of that ensign is, in fact, that in the Holy Land, the Jews have been reassembled in a nation that is called Israel today, and that the League of Nations unanimously granted the rights of the land to Israel. I won't get into that thorny issue. My point is, these are geopolitical developments that are, in fact, fulfillments of prophecy. And if you have something in the revelation that is confusing you to see what's actually happening and to understand and interpret prophecy, and none of it makes sense. But if you have the right lens and perspective, and I'm not saying I'm right, I have a perspective, I could be right, it's just one of many. But you see how the unfolding of the Jewish prophecies and covenants, the Christian prophecies and covenants, and when Jesus would return and sit on of glory and judge the nations, well, you have now this fulfillment, and this is one way of looking at it, that the nations are now being judged by that common document, and we have miserably failed. So that's my point, is that this is a sacred matter, because it is the fulfillment of prophecy and the divine will of how the nations should agree, how the nations should cooperate, how the nations should work together to build a world of peace and harmony, as described in those prophecies of Isaiah and Micah that we read at the beginning of the show. And if the nations perform that function with the degree of integrity that they've all agreed, forget about God now for a second. Okay, that God is dead now for a second. And if the nations only do what they themselves have declared they should do, then you do not have what's going on in Ukraine right now. Right? Because the very participants in that, Russia, Ukraine, Great Britain, and the United States, who have enough power collectively to do something about it, said we will never happen. And yet it's happening, and the world is in turmoil and chaos because the nations are not honoring their own agreements, the sacred agreements that they have entered into, which are, in fact, as I've said, my opinion, the fulfillment of all these biblical prophecies. When one takes a look at the world through this light, suddenly it all begins to make sense, because God is in fact in charge. He is the creator who sits outside of time and space and can write history in advance. It's called prophecy. The history book that was written in advance is simply called prophecy. And it's unfolding all around us, and it's been described through these ancient languages and metaphors, but nonetheless clear when one just takes a step back and says, well, look, this is going on. What does World War II really mean? Why were the Jews involved? Why did they end up with a state coming out of the end of it? Could it be that there's something here prophetically? Well, we have to take off the blinders of our preconceived ideas of what we were taught through the religion that was groping to try to understand it from a perspective of centuries ago, and has been unable to update its understanding because of dogma and a frozen in time understanding that people are unable to shift their perspective when the events all around them tell them something different is happening. So that's a really long answer to your question there about, the coercion and what God does and doesn't do. And what today he's expecting the nations to do it, but the Bible describes it as though Jesus himself is doing it, because in fact the unseen hand of God is in fact in charge of human affairs.
I think that, like, in talking to you, Wade, and you could be wrong about your like the meaning of the prophecies. You might be right. You might be partially wrong or right, or whatever it is. Regardless of that, when you look at the text that way, whether you're religious or not, it shows you that there's this drama happening that's been happening for thousands of years, it's a play. It's a story that's been evolving for thousands of years, and I think that there's something when you see it from that perspective, there's something. It gives meaning to people. It gives meaning to your life in a different way that you might not otherwise have had. And so I think that I just appreciate being able to look at things from that perspective, because most people in their lives, they you live in your little house and you go to your job and you're like inside this big world, and it seems so confusing, and a lot of it's not good. A lot of the stuff you see in the news and what's happening is just all bad news, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and it might be depressing, and then all you have is your job and your car and and whatever life you've carved out for yourself in whatever corner of the world, and to like see to read text like that and to actually try to place yourself in this massive story that's been happening for thousands or tens of thousands of years. Just, I think it's a relief. For me, it's a relief to see the world that way, and it's almost a delight.
So what has changed in the perspective that you've had over let's say the last year since you and I have been talking, and I've been sharing some of that perspective with you?
Well, it's just what I said. I don't see the world only from my little hole in the ground. Like I see, there's a lot of different ways to see the world, and I think in the Bible.
I guess what's changed. So there's the philosophy that begins and ends with words, right? There's the fact that we want to know, we want to understand. I am one that craves to know and understand. But I also am one to try to, I'm the mad scientist that injects myself with my own serum constantly. It's like, okay, I have this new understanding. I want to immediately go put it into practice. I'll dive into the deep end, Sure, this experience, just jump into it. What has changed in your life and how you've gone about your affairs?
It makes my life matter more, right? It makes my life matter more, not just, I can try to be a virtuous person, but then when I look out at the world and everything that's happening in it, everything I do on this micro level of my life and every person I talk to, all those interactions ripple into what's happening on the macro level, right? Because I can see the virtues that I strive to attain paralleling and a sort of like a metaphor for the way nations are treating each other, right? And so and also I can see that there is, if I'm watching the world progress and move around me, it's not just chaos. So I think that you have a role to play on the planet, right, for your life, and it gives you more meaning, and it gives you more traction, and it gives you everything that happens around you. It gives you something to hold on to. You can climb around, you can move about, you can get pushed around, and I just think that it makes everything matter more. And I think that's what people need is more meaning in their lives, and for everything, that all the chaos that's happening around them, to have more meaning. I mean, I'm not sure I answered your question 100%. I'm not sure I can, but that in itself is sort of an antidote for a lot of the suffering that's happening in the world, for people to know that their lives have meaning within this massive chaotic story that's unfolding. That it is a story. It's not just a collection of catastrophic events that are going to go on, forever.
Yep, and we're going to add Daniel here, who we had talked about moving the show to an hour later, and I announced at the beginning that we're doing that starting next week. But I had probably not been as clear as I should have been, and Daniel is just now showing up to start the show. So Daniel, thank you so much. We'll probably go at least a few minutes late, though. We're going to try to do a little bit better of keeping to our hour. But what I will share is that we've gone through a lot of material, Daniel, that we'll share with you going forward to bring you up to speed. But right now I wanted to just add to what Jafar was saying here, is that the changes in behavior can be very subtle, which gets back to this quote we were reading. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of glory, and before him shall be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them from one another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And Daniel, we've been talking about how the Universal Declaration of human rights is the standard which the world has chosen based on the golden rule, based on the words of Jesus, frankly, of loving your neighbor as yourself and treating them with respect and dignity, and affording every neighbor. And who is my neighbor? Jesus was asked, and basically the answer is everyone. Affording every human being the minimum standard. This makes sense when we're talking about nations as a whole who have this responsibility to clothe the naked, to give water to the thirsty, to visit those in prison, right? And not treat them as pariahs. This is a standard that a nation should adhere to. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the nations have all signed up for this project. And in fact, the judgment that is happening, these nations are being judged as sheep or goats today. And this is a divine ordinance and a divine prophecy that is being fulfilled. But what I wanted to key on, Jafar, is there is a very personal element. And so for those who perhaps do get too wrapped around some of the words, some of the specific meanings that are interpreted into the words that they read in the holy writings in the name of religion, this really does level set and bring it down to those basic fundamental principles that are accessible to all. And to your point, Jafar, about life having more meaning once you have this clarity of what's going on the big picture, gives your life more meaning and perhaps more motivation to pay attention to these little details, to pay attention to the people around us, and to make sure that we are treating every human being with dignity and respect. And that, in fact, is the standard that is being used in this passage in Matthew to determine who ultimately will receive the divine rewards, or who will be found lacking and wanting and will not receive those benefits for not having obtained this minimum standard of human conduct. So, Daniel, welcome. And I don't know, perhaps what we can do is invite you to comment on something that Jafar was sharing earlier about Nietzsche, right? Jafar, do you want to just sort of reiterate that? Because it's in this context, Daniel, where something that Jafar said about what Nietzsche meant in his view around God is dead, actually being instructive and reflective in the emergence of this standard where humanity is now judging itself and not necessarily looking to a divine external power to establish that standard. Right? Do you want to comment on that, Jafar? And
yeah, we talked about it a couple episodes ago, Daniel. And so it's just the idea that, okay, if there is no God, and Nietzsche said, he observed his century, and he said that it appears that God is dying or is dead. And so if Europe, or if the Catholic Church no longer holds sway over the hearts of the general population, and those principles no longer necessarily rule over people, no longer are ruled over by those commandments or those truths, then Nietzsche believed that men would create their own truths to create the guiding principles or the goals and the ethics and the standards that everybody should live by. And so Nietzsche believed that if that happened, and he predicted it would, that it would be ruinous. It would be catastrophic. And so he also from that he had the idea of a man that would be more powerful than other men that would determine these rules and these standards, right? The Ubermensch, or the Superman. And so that group of people or that class would then take control. And you can go into stuff, but like I have friends that are smarter than me by a lot, and I have some very few friends that are smarter than me by such a degree that it's I feel like they're almost a different species. Like there's levels of intelligence that go through the roof. And if so it is possible. I mean, that's kind of a side point. But so then the story goes that the Nazis took hold of this. So like, well, we're the smart ones. We're gonna determine what the world's gonna be like, and we're gonna create the rules, and we're gonna and so that's kind of the fulfillment of Nietzsche's prophecy that along would come this nation of these people that would try to do things their way without any with nothing above them, right, to guide them or to submit to, say, right. So that's kind of the problem of a world without this invisible God, right. And I don't know what the Greeks said or did about that, or what Plato, what his ideas were in the Republic. I would be interested in knowing that.
Well, and one last input into this, it's all in the context of coercion, right? And that where one believes that one knows and one has a superior knowledge or ideology or whatever it is, then one actually seizes upon the means. It's not even a matter of the means, the end justifying the means. One looks for opportunity to deploy those objectives, those goals, and any crisis will do when it comes along, right? Or any situation or any cause belli, right?
Right. So then it's men creating the good. It's like the gods aren't the good isn't good because the God said it, or said it's good, or it wasn't good and then the God said it was. It's like men are just creating the good, and they believe it because there's no authority above them to say no, you're wrong. They can't go to the Bible and realize they're wrong, or they can't. Their friends can't go to the Bible and say, hey, you're wrong, because there's no standard, right? So then they're the one creating the good. And so they become gods, right? So if you're the one creating what's right and wrong, you are essentially a god. And so you have the right to coerce people to obey your truths because they're divine, essentially. So that to me is a crucial problem of a world without God. And then the other, anyways, that there was one other thing, like if this world is the end all be all and there's no next world, then it kind of makes what happened in this life matter more, to the extent that maybe lying isn't such a bad thing, because I'm going to die anyways, and let's see how many lies I can get away with before I die, because why not? Like there's no reason why not to do that.
Well, I have a question for you, Jafar. I'm really interested in why you thought your intelligence wasn't up there with some friends of yours. Like, I mean, I'm just curious why you.
No,
and
it's
then
just
why in the context you brought it up.
It's just raw. So the reason why I said that, it's just raw brain power. Some people have the ability to manipulate ideas in their head one at a time. Some people can manipulate more than one idea in their head at a time, and some people can recall facts and figures better than other people. I don't happen to be super good at remembering details of facts and figures or names and stuff like that. And some people, there's people that can remember everything almost that they come across. And if when you have that kind of bat in your hand, it's like it's an unfair fight if there's no rules, right? Like someone with that amount of intelligence can clean up, and I've talked to people like that, and it's humbling and humiliating if they want to pick you apart. You're kind of at their whim. So that's why it, to me, and the analogy is that like a big guy with a lot of muscles, if you're in a fight, like he's just gonna probably win unless you know jiu-jitsu or something. So it's and I see that happening in the business world. Like you have people who have a massive amount of intelligence and capacity and charisma, and if they don't have any morals, they can do a lot of harm.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me give you an option. I could respond by trying to give you some advice, which I don't think is a really good thing to do. But it's the thing that came to my mind was to try and give you some advice on how to approach Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
sure, yeah.
Yeah? Want to do that? Okay.
Yeah.
It comes from the most sincere place, though, right? It just I almost imagined when you were explaining, that position from Nietzsche on God is dead, for example. And everything that you explained is verbatim what would be echoing within society as a concern, right? And I think my question to you is, do you want to be an echo, or do you want to attempt to try and synthesize something for yourself? And I don't mean that to push you on your heels, but I mean that from a standpoint of, if I could tell you something that would distance from the echoes, number one, are you open to having the capacity to understand, right? And I'm thinking the best way to explain this was two people that are very faithful, devout, religious people, right? Both yourself, Wade, and Jafar. I want you to really think about this idea of God being a natural entity in the world. Very natural. And I think that there's a buttressing effect to saying, I can let stuff go because God is there and God has the plan. It's the unfolding of His glory, right? There's a natural unfolding that only He can know. So there's a relinquishing in that. And it's not a giving up. It's trying to say that's a good enough fight for me. I'm okay, mouthing the echoes of society because it's actually a good fight to fight. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I'm not following.
I'm not following you either. because and here's I'm struggling because I thought you said to Jafar, what you said was an echo, and let me share something with you to help you see that it might be better to come up with a different idea. But it sounds like you just now said, well, the idea is the echo's fine, don't worry about it. So I'm confused.
No, yeah, right. So but that's the one thing. If we decide to go into dangerous territory, right? And we try and derive some value from Nietzsche's writing, or anything that we decide to do as public intellectuals, there's a risk associated with it, right? You have to start from foundational first principles and then derive from there, right? And so in many aspects, and maybe it reminds me of the dialogue from Plato Meno, I'd say, Jafar, you have all the capability, and I know you may not have the instant recall, but you have that God-given innate ability of rationality to be what you want to be in this world, right? And sometimes I feel that the conversation gets a little bit argumentative to the other side, which I guess would be just society's barbarous nature overall.
So like the no God side, or
well, I try and want to stay away from the no God side. I mean, I'm trying to make the point that if there is this fundamental, like, regardless of belief, He's there anyways. If I can simplify it and vulgate, He's there. It doesn't matter if you don't believe Him. It doesn't matter if it's going to work itself out. You can't ignore it. It's there. And so then it comes down to say, well, what's your role and what's Wade's role? It's almost ultimately like a libertarian sort of role, or not a libertarian, but like a liberating role, right? Say, like, all these people around me, you can suffer, and you're going to have such horrible experiences ditch to ditch. If you would just, if you would just pay attention to the teachings of God, then it would be a much more pleasant ride.
I don't know. Maybe I'm like, I'm not someone who tries to argue for God or religion, generally speaking. I do it with my friends as kind of it's my way of looking. Well, like when I'm interacting with Scripture, for example, it becomes part of the story, I guess. Like I'm not someone who's generally ever goes and tries to. I mean, I did when I was younger. When I was in school, I might try to argue, like I would argue with my professors about whether God existed or what it meant and so on. I did that, and I got over that. Yeah. So I'm not trying to do that. It's something else that I'm trying to do. And I might not know what it is. I'm kind of, I think it has to do with the Bible, and I'm trying to re-understand what it is that I mean by God. And what it and what it is that I don't mean by God. And I think it's more important to understand what God doesn't mean, or what religion doesn't mean, because that's kind of what a lot of what I'm doing. So I'm definitely not trying. Like I remember in school, I would make comments, and then the people that were religious would put their crosses back under their shirts. My friend after class would say, "Yeah, that girl, she put her cross back under her shirt." And then I would make arguments for, like, I'm trying to, I am trying to explore for myself, and I think that's what I want to do. What I want to do is be with people who want to explore reality, and I don't care. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if it's God or religion, but that earnest, like passion to figure out what's really going on. That's kind of what I like to get at.
All right. Well, so here's the doctrine that you might want to follow if you were in agreement with how I would view philosophy since Plato. Okay. So very quickly, it goes from ancient Greece. Ancient Greece Hellenizes the world, basically defines the West, and infiltrates basically Christianity, all the Abrahamic religions, right? Okay, that's kind of the force. I'm going to leave Christianity out of it because it's kind of got its own sort of point. But basically, in the thread of philosophy, I think the Greeks got it almost perfect. Really, I do. Almost perfect. And they sure tried. What happened is that there's a first modern philosopher, which is really known as or identified as René Descartes. And so René Descartes basically is like, well, they call him the father of modern philosophy, okay? And he starts to put things like coordinate systems into the way we think, explaining things in terms of a duality, right? So I think from there on, then we saw a lot of the German philosophers, and we get into Kant, who takes something like even just a basic understanding and breaks it down into time, number one, space, which is distance, okay, or in space, okay, and causality. And so notice that is the main wheel now that we're looking at. I mean, in terms of, you could call that the true atheist if you were going to embody it. It has no virtue ethic in it, right? There's no moving towards a goodness in that. That time has no element of ethics in it. Space has no time of ethics, and causality doesn't have anything in that, right? His asterisk to try and fix it, this is Immanuel Kant, was to say, well, let's do a categorical imperative. Like, biologically, we're all just anyways. You can kind of see how, if you're writing a novel, you can kind of see, well, the writers didn't do too good on that, right? I mean, that's my impression anyways, okay? Now, but the reason why I'm bringing all this backstory up, it's really important. So then you have someone like Friedrich Nietzsche, okay, who I think even in our time, if we could take a step back out of our culture, we kind of popularize or idolize these types of people and thinkers, and he was very bizarre, actually. I read his stuff and I get very frustrated with his stuff because he's a madman. Like, he's crazy. He's brilliant, but he's literally a madman. And so when I read something, maybe much the same like when you're studying scripture, or either Wade or Jafar, both of you, you're reading it to get inspired and fill yourself with this, not this existential dread that isn't even there, right? If God's there, God's there. That's your belief. That's your fundamental principle. You should never allow anything to come in and undermine that. So it's all noise. It's all noise. And it's like the more we amplify the noise of Nietzsche and this idea of God is dead, well, it's a moot point, right? Unless it becomes something in and of itself. If culture grabs it enough to snowball it into something that becomes cult-like, then that's the issue that you're guarding against. And you're best to just, in my opinion, just describe it the way I did it, because that's exactly what it is. That's the threat. The threat is that it becomes some sort of self-perpetuating cult. That ideology of God is dead. And, think about how a virus spreads. How would that spread? What makes things spread?
But let me just jump in here and say that you're now at the point of what I heard Jafar saying, which is that Nietzsche predicted that the outcome of removing God from a governing factor in human thought and in individual lives would result in a virus, in a pandemic spreading, in which we would end up with the results that we did.
Yeah, I mean, it's always easy. I mean, it's very easy to be pessimistic, right? I mean, studies in pessimism. I like what, Arthur. You can be so right most of the time by predicting something that is going to be negative in the future, right? Like, it's not a prophet. That and I think a lot about what prophet means, and I think. What is it that truly delivers the glory of God and everything that it embodies? That, to me, is a prophet. And it can be as simple as someone speaking the truth.
Well, and so
not a world event or a history or like that.
Well, but one of the things that you missed was the prophecies about, going back to Isaiah and Micah, about beating swords into plowshares. Actually, which is the United Nations statute, right? They shall beat their swords into plowshares. Mm-hmm. That's pulled from a context of the immediately preceding context. So it's not a general context. It's the specific context of those words is Jesus. Well, in the Hebrew scriptures, it's not Jesus, but it is the King, the Messiah, coming and sitting down to judge the nations. And he, as he judges them, will teach them to beat their swords into plowshares. And then the same with the quote that I said from Jesus. Then he says, look, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will judge the nations. And what I said was the proximity of 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel coming out of World War II, and the Declaration of Human Rights, those things are quantum entangled, right? You don't have one without the other. You don't have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without World War II and the Holocaust, right? They are inextricably tied together. And what I see in this is the fulfillment of a related prophecy in which it says, the law will go forth from Zion. And another prophecy which says, he will magnify the law and make it honorable, which is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, in my opinion. It is the magnification of the law, and it has been made honorable. It has taken it out of the context of God. In that sense, it's a step forward. You could say backwards, but I'm going to say step forward. It's a step forward from the Declaration of Independence that says we were created with unalienable rights. It says, no, we have these rights. By virtue of being human, there's this universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is the golden rule. It is treat your neighbor as you want to be treated. Treat your neighbor with the same dignity that you want to treat yourself. And it has been applied universally. The law has been magnified and made honorable. That is the fulfillment of a very positive prophecy, not a negative, pessimistic prophecy.
So I think the way I'm viewing and this ties into what you're saying. I think so, Daniel. Like, I think what you're saying is that I can just observe what's happening, and I don't need to. And correct me if I'm, I'm just trying to clarify your position. Like, I don't need to be concerned with, whether or not Nietzsche's argument was true, or whether he prophesied something happening, or I don't need to be concerned with, things are just happening. I can watch them happen in this way, and I don't. Like, I guess, I mean, there's a reason why I do that, and I'm not sure it's the reason that you think I do it. So I'm trying to get a better idea of why you think I have this desire to say, okay, Nietzsche meant this, and then this happened, and that means that, religion has a role play or doesn't have a role play, and God exists or doesn't exist. Like, I have my own reason for thinking that, and so I want to know what you think my reason is, I guess.
I was fine on a baseline reason of saying that really it starts from your own edification of trying to understand things, right?
Right.
And your own personal research. I think that's almost like the starting point for all of us being,
right,
in this virtual room, right? Now,
yep,
if there was a slight variance to that, I would just say that was an assumption on from my standpoint, right?
Yeah, I was trying to get at
right?
what you're saying, but I guess my reason for viewing things the way I do through this lens is that I'm trying to create a story, right?
Yeah.
Which is what the Bible is a bunch of stories. I'm trying to create a story that puts me, that I want to be in the story, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
People like stories, and I want you to be in the story, and I want Wade to be in the story, and I want all my friends to be in the story, because stories have meaning, and they start in a place, and there's drama in the end. And it does something for us. Like, humans need that, and I want other people to. I want us all to be in the same story, because if we're all in the same story, then we can know that it's just a game, and we can start to explore the game with a certain level of detachment, which is what all the religions want, right? Like the Eastern religions and the Western religions, you to be like a certain, and even the new spiritual teachings, kind of new wave spirituality. There's a lot about attachment. Watch your thoughts, kind of observe yourself more objectively. Like, once we see ourselves as actors in a play, then if you piss me off or say something to hurt my feelings, I can objectify that instance, right? And I can and with that objectification, I don't have to react, and we can go forward, and I can forgive you because there's this greater thing that's happening, right? And so it's the understanding of that greater thing and the creation of this story that we can all participate in, so that we can explore the universe, inner and outer, together without fighting, basically. Like, that's what I want, and I maybe I'm wrong about Nietzsche, like I said, I'm not the smartest guy, so like, but like, maybe I'm wrong about Nietzsche. It doesn't, to some degree, if you tell me I'm wrong about Nietzsche, that's okay, because let's create a better story together. That's what I want. That's what
you're right about Nietzsche. I mean, you're right about him in terms of what everybody says about him.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
You can imagine that someone would say there seems to be a preoccupation focusing on the wrong things, or the wrong aspects of what what his influence should have been, right? But I mean, let's leave that aside. I think you're on the right track. I think that's really, really commendable. I was like doing silent applauses because I was about creating a story where you're putting the people around you in the story. And I think that's maybe the first point to stop on and say, when you do that, you're really building community, right? I mean, even though we are, only connecting in technology, we're still doing it in a way where it's not just a worship towards a Jordan Peterson or somebody who's not in this circle, right? Or somebody that's not even alive, right? It's about trying to actually involve everybody into the process, and I think that's
well. So I'm glad
if there's a creation aspect to it, like if you're creating something and trying to discover and ask the tough questions and have honest conversations, right?
Yeah, well, and you know, I like how you bring up, well, Jordan Peterson's interesting.
Hey guys, if I may, I'm going to go ahead and sign off of the live broadcast, and we'll continue this discussion internally, just because I made a commitment to not let these shows go on for 2 hours, right? So I think a quick reminder to everybody to like and subscribe to stay tuned for updates, and to tune in next week an hour later. And Daniel Jafar will be here a half an hour later so that we can sync up beforehand. So thank you everyone for tuning in. We're going to continue this particular discussion about the three of us learning from each other. If you really want to know, reach out. We'll include you in that conversation. But we'll be back next week, an hour from the normal time, which is the time that will be here next week will be 8 o'clock Central, 9 o'clock Eastern, 6 o'clock Pacific time. Thank you everyone for tuning into It Created in the Image of God, exploring the role of religion in society. See you next week.